I think it's safe to say that one of my earliest exposures to trans or gender nonconforming identity on screen came in Jonathan Demme's 1991 film, The Silence of the Lambs. A fictional story about an aspiring FBI agent named Clarice Starling who must use one killer to find another, the film is a true masterclass of horror, suspense, and thought-provoking commentary. For what it's worth, I adore how the film directly grapples with the misogyny Starling faces in her day-to-day life and how Demme paints an oppressive picture of the male power structures working against her at every turn, from the seemingly innocent to the incomprehensibly horrific. Yet, in attempting to paint this horrific picture of male domination over femininity, the film creates the character of Buffalo Bill, a horrific serial killer who kidnaps, murders, and then wears the skin of women. While both the film and book make clear that Bill is not truly transgender, it's hard to understate the negative impact the character has had on the queer community, specifically on the public perception of transgender women. At best, he's a personification of heteronormative fears about the violation of traditional values, and at worst, he's the embodiment of what every trans woman fears being told, that they are not girls, but instead bizarre, predatory perversions of women. The character is designed to, through his queer-coded nature, unsettle audiences. Nevertheless, even as a child watching Silence, I don't remember recoiling from Bill's twisted drag performance or sensual application of makeup and piercings. I remember being strangely fascinated with that aspect of his character, even finding it weirdly beautiful, only pushing away from the obviously unjustifiable crimes he commits on screen. I also remember thinking that whatever real beauty I found in the performance was just false. I mean, what could be truly beautiful about a character that seems so distinctly queer-coded? No, it was beautiful in another way. Bizarrely so. Beautiful because it was strange and disturbing. That's the beauty I found in the character, nothing more, nothing less. But as time went on, I discovered others didn't really see Bill the same way I did. Bill is seen today as one of the more disturbing and twisted horror villains of all time, not because of the murdering or skinning, but because he dares to present as queer while he does it all. If audiences didn't find Bill sickening in 1991, recent attacks on gender identity, queer sexuality, and especially the drag scene will ensure that Bill is now their absolute worst nightmare. But I found something there, and that matters. Where others were simply disgusted or appalled, I felt something just the slightest bit endearing about Ted Levine's performance as this perversion of cultural norms. As my life has gone on and I've changed as a person, growing into a proud queer woman, I've finally become able to vocalize what it was I felt as a child watching Silence for the first time. Beyond all the horrible representation, all the sick and disgusting actions taken by Bill, all the ways the film reinforces that Bill is extra bad because he transgresses gender, for a brief moment, what I saw in the character was not a strange beauty in the macabre, but the true beauty of queer expression through body horror. Welcome to Making Media Matter, and today we're talking about gender, sexuality, and the queer liberation found at the heart of one of cinema's most disturbing subgenres. Enjoy. This is easily my biggest, most researched, most edited video to date. It's very close to my heart, and I tried to make it really special for you guys because I know for so many of you, it will also be very personal. I attempted to include as many queer identities here as I could, but I do speak from the perspective of a pansexual trans woman, so there are voices much more qualified than my own to speak on certain queer identities as they appear in body horror. That being said, I encourage anyone who feels I misrepresented or underreported on something to correct me or make their own video and add to the conversation. Also, as I discussed this topic, I did at points find myself struggling to label everything I wanted to mention under the banner of body horror. For the sake of this video's title being accurate, I did try my best to explain how the vast majority of things I mention here relate to body horror in general, but I'm sure some of you will feel I miscategorize things, and while that's all fine, I just don't want the comments to be exclusively about how certain pieces of media aren't exactly body horror, so I'm addressing it here. My definition of body horror for this video is very broad and basically includes any horror related to the human body. Even that definition might be a little too specific, but it's the best I can do. Finally, I stuck pretty rigidly to movies and TV here because including other forms of media in my analysis would have just given me too much to sift through. Even in film and television alone, there are a lot of pieces of content I simply haven't seen. I tried to watch as much stuff as possible for the purposes of this video, but if a movie or television show you love that you feel perfectly relates to queer body horror is absent in this video, just know I probably didn't have time to watch it. Feel free to drop any recommendations in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And again, enjoy the video. In an essay on trans horror by the author Susan Stryker, she writes, quote, "The transsexual body is an unnatural body. It is the product of medical science. It is a technological construction. It is flesh torn apart and sewn together again in a shape other than that in which it was born." Stryker, with this quote, lays bare the unique way in which the transsexual community are able to see themselves reflected through body horror. It makes clear sense that for those of us who have undergone medical care and surgeries to align our bodies with our gender identities, there's a real kinship to be found in characters who defy conventional definitions of what a body is and can aspire to be. Characters who lean into the horrific act of bodily transformation. And that concept is undoubtedly interesting. It connects a large piece of the trans community to some of the oldest horror stories such as Frankenstein, and definitely speaks to a large component of why body horror is so appealing to trans people. If others are already going to view us as different for changing our bodies, isn't it empowering to lean into that image? I would say yes, and we'll definitely circle back to this point when we discuss queer horror villains, but the root of Stryker's interpretation brushes against what I would classify as the most obvious reason why so many genderqueer people relate to body horror in the first place. If we are to talk about how the genderqueer body is related to perceived unnatural transformations on screen, I think we have to talk about what is, for many queer people, the most upsetting transformation of all: puberty. Regardless of medical care or surgical changes, for trans and gender nonconforming individuals, it's very easy to feel that the physical vessel is a prison of sorts, changing or attempting to change in a way you don't want it to. There is nothing scarier than enduring the wrong puberty, suffering through physical changes that aren't in alignment with the self-image you have in your mind. And horror is a genre that understands this horrifying side of puberty completely, often portraying the process in a bone-chilling way. In that turning of puberty into horror, I think many scary movies end up taking on so much relatability to genderqueer people. In John Fawcett's 2000 film Ginger Snaps, viewers follow the story of two sisters, both on the edge of adulthood, as one is bitten by and transformed into a werewolf. The transformation is explicitly tied to puberty, as the sister, named Ginger, draws the attention of a werewolf with her menstrual blood. Instead of framing this transformation as a natural part of Ginger's identity, Fawcett embraces the inherent horror of puberty, intrinsically linking the film with queer experience, whether intentionally or not. On the surface, Ginger Snaps is primarily a story about adolescence, with Ginger's sister Bridget acting as a foil to Ginger herself, who uses a forceful brand of puberty to dominate and overwhelm everyone around her. The film sees Bridget, in parallel to Ginger, learn to grow into her adulthood by healthy and natural means, eventually killing off the more harmful representation of puberty that is Ginger. But that's not to say the film can't be interpreted, at least in part, along very queer lines. Ginger's transformation takes her from a more androgynous character into one that's decidedly feminine and consumed by her own body. She becomes trapped inside her physical vessel in a manner that many queer and trans people will undoubtedly be able to relate to. Bridget ends the film by fiercely maintaining her childhood self, standing strong in the face of an oncoming female puberty. It's easy to read the ending of Ginger Snaps as Bridget refusing to have her life dominated by puberty, instead refuting whatever physical changes might be on the horizon. It's an uplifting ending for any queer person who's ever felt the pressures of pubescent transformation on their personal life. And we see other examples of the werewolf as shorthand for monstrous puberty in other werewolf stories. Whether it be the hairy and painful transformation sequences of An American Werewolf in London, the comedic exploration of adolescence found in Teen Wolf, or of course, the Hug Wolf episode of Adventure Time, where our main character Finn, hitting puberty head-on, is transformed into a werewolf-type creature that hugs everyone around him. It's about sex. But the whole concept of monstrous puberty is far from tied to strictly werewolf media. Matter of fact, Jennifer's Body, a 2009 film directed by Karen Kusama that strongly parallels Ginger Snaps, features nothing in the way of werewolves, instead telling the story of the comedically named Needy and her childhood best friend Jennifer, who is transformed into a succubus. As with Ginger Snaps, Jennifer's Body uses horrific transformation as shorthand for the horrors and burdens of adolescence. Jennifer, as a character, is undeniably more sexually liberated than Needy, and the film, told from the perspective of Needy, initially frames that sexual liberation as extremely desirable. But what we learn as the film goes on is that Jennifer uses her sexuality and image out of a real desperation to remain desirable for others. She wants to be popular and feel special in a way that most girls are conditioned to from a young age, and in line with that harmful conditioning, she sees sexually exploiting her own body to men as the primary means of achieving the life she desires. After Jennifer is abducted and demonically sacrificed in an encounter meant to evoke the imagery of assault, Jennifer becomes a void of angst and sexual domination, ruthlessly feeding on boys in her own town to satiate an undead hunger. As C.C. Chapman writes for Swamp Flicks, quote, Jennifer discovers that she can regain her power and her gorgeous looks by seducing and literally feeding off male victims, which magically restores her vitality and sex appeal. Jennifer may have preyed on men prior to her transformation, but her curse creates an extreme situation where her behavior is more horrific and she becomes even more physically attractive, both to the audience and to her subsequent victims. We can read Jennifer's death and transformation along a variety of lines. Maybe the sacrifice represents the breaking of Jennifer's character under the oppression of sexism, and Jennifer's ensuing murders are indicative of a woman fractured by a patriarchal system, enacting a violent version of what she's been conditioned to do her whole life, feed off men to gain self-worth. Maybe the assault is a metaphor for real-life sexual assault, and Jennifer throughout the film is displaying how cycles of abuse, especially those endured at a young age, can perpetuate themselves in damaging ways. Note that Jennifer never actually gets revenge on those who killed her, instead just uplifting herself by hurting others. Maybe Jennifer's murder simply shows how invasive and unstoppable puberty can feel, her devouring of men showing how pubescent girls are pressured to find validation through sex in a way that can harm themselves and potential partners. Or maybe the film is a trans allegory, Jennifer's death representing coming out and the film alluding to the pressures trans women feel to affirm themselves through sex with men. But regardless of how you want to take the film, Jennifer's transformation is deeply tied to her burgeoning femininity, eliciting the same type of monstrous puberty and queer subtext that we saw in Ginger Snaps. Interestingly, in Jennifer's Body, the monstrous puberty is directly tied to being queer, as Needy and Jennifer possess more than a little sapphic chemistry, their potential relationship hinting at a more loving and healthy alternative to Jennifer's reality of sexually devouring others. Here, very literally, puberty is framed in opposition to the queer. And for all the talking I've done about how body horror ties into the trans or gender nonconforming experience, I'd be doing a great disservice to the breadth of queer reality if I didn't touch on how puberty also directly hurts cisgender people with queer sexual orientations. In Jennifer's Body, a possible lesbian relationship is crushed by the pressures of heteronormativity as made manifest by puberty. This is often seen in the real world, where the second puberty hits, there's this immense pressure to adhere rigidly to sexual tradition, to begin the process of having children and settling down. It's a tragedy that underlies the story of Jennifer's Body, making the ending where only Needy survives more than a little bittersweet. Unlike Bridget in Ginger Snaps, Needy does experience her feminine puberty as represented by Monstrous' transformation at the end of Jennifer's body, inheriting some of Jennifer's powers but without the need to eat others to sustain them. In fact, Needy actively weaponizes her monstrous puberty to her advantage, instead of just confidently bracing for its arrival. And it's not the last time we'll see a character do exactly that. I'd be remiss not to touch on the pure embodiment of weaponizing monstrous puberty here, that being, of course, Carrie White from Brian De Palma's 1976 film Carrie. The film starts with Carrie getting her period, and in direct connection with that opening scene, ends with Carrie losing her shit after getting a bucket of blood dumped on her. All the religious and sexual repression Carrie endures bubbles to the surface as she enters adolescence, absolutely ruining prom night for quite a few people. But you've likely already heard about Carrie in immense detail, and I don't need to sit here and explain to you why she's a shining example of the weaponized monstrous puberty that we saw in Jennifer's body. Instead, I want to shine a light on another character that speaks to all the same themes in a much more potently queer way, Angela Baker from the 1983 film Sleepaway Camp. I've already discussed the original Sleepaway Camp in great detail on my channel before, but for the purposes of this video, what you need to know is that Sleepaway Camp tells the story of Angela, a canonically transgender killer who murders everyone that wrongs her during an extended stay at summer camp. In the film, Angela's gender identity is played for shock value in a finale that was undoubtedly intended to be extremely transphobic. But the film's final moments actually provide something in the way of queer catharsis and commentary on the monstrous puberty trope. Angela is a character who gets revenge on those who would dare to bully and harass her, rebelling against the ills of homophobia and transphobia in a sense. At the film's end, when Angela displays her body in a bizarre and disturbing manner for others to see, she is committing the ultimate act of transgression against her repressive society. If we choose to view the story as a twisted queer coming-of-age narrative, then this is the moment where Angela embraces herself fully and chooses to use her monstrous puberty as a means of scaring others. She embraces the monster that society has painted her to be, wielding the monstrous puberty that she's hidden for the whole film to her benefit. It becomes a perfect display of how body horror can be used as a means for queer empowerment, a rejection of letting puberty become this thing we mask or hide, even when we don't have access to puberty blockers or hormone replacement therapy. Somewhat controversially, there's also an interpretation of Ari Aster's Hereditary that analyzes the film along the lines of monstrous queer puberty. While many might be quick to disregard this interpretation, I think it's important we actually engage with it because it genuinely holds a lot of weight. Hereditary tells the story of the Graham family who, after the death of their matriarch, become tormented and consumed by the twisted and occult plans she laid out for them before her passing. This results in the death of the Graham daughter Charlie, the mental collapse of the mother Annie, the destruction of the father Steve, and the possession of the son Alex by the spirit of the deceased daughter. While I think the film is first and foremost about the inescapable grip of family, whether it be through inherited mental illness, trauma, or some other factor, much like Ginger Snaps, it's hard to ignore that Hereditary is loosely a queer narrative, one about a daughter transforming into a son and the fallout of that transformation. Nick Spheres, one of my absolute favorite horror YouTubers and the person who I first heard this interpretation from, said of the film, quote,
"Okay, so the movie is the art piece made by the mother throughout the course of the movie, wherein she tells the story of how she lost her daughter. She lost her daughter because her daughter transitioned into her son. Her daughter was transgender and turned into her son."
And once you see Hereditary in that context, it's hard to view the movie without at least considering the queer lens. Specifically, by framing the story almost exclusively from the perspective of the mother figure, who clearly does not want to accept the transition of her daughter into her son, Aster is able to explore, whether intentionally or not, the grief, anguish, pain, and most importantly for us, perceived body horror that can accompany transition. It's a common talking point among parents grappling with their child's transition to grieve the loss of their child, who is ultimately still there. It's also common for parents to view the prospect of gender-affirming care as somehow horrific and twisted, something akin to a car decapitation, for instance. Hereditary, through framing itself around the mother character, flips the monstrous puberty trope to explore the darker side of being queer and the impact of the so-called monstrous puberty on the family unit. While a quote-unquote natural puberty is horrific for the genderqueer people who are forced to endure it, in the eyes of those who don't support us, the monstrous puberty is transition itself. The ending of the film, much like that of Sleepaway Camp, sees our transcoded characters stand in plain view of others as their full self. In a sense, it is empowering, but it's also an ending that is much more hollow and thrown into question than those of the other films we've discussed. The camera zooms out to display our finale inside of a dollhouse of sorts, an allusion to the miniature art installations that the mother figure Annie made earlier in the movie. The interpretation here is either that the entire film is an art installation by the mother created to cope with her son's transition, an interpretation I quite enjoy, or that the ending simply shows how powerless the characters are. The events of the film were always destined to happen, and the destruction of the family unit was inescapable. It's somber and tragic, and definitely leaves our transcoded character feeling more than a little broken and helpless, but it's sadly true to life at the end of the day. Hereditary offers us, through the use of monstrous puberty, a window into some of the pain and hurt that can accompany being queer. It's not the empowering fun time we can read Sleepaway Camp to be, the embrace of monstrous puberty found in Jennifer's body, or even the bittersweet rejection of false puberty seen in Ginger Snaps, but it explores an uncomfortable truth about being queer in general. And this more complex exploration of the queer struggle leads perfectly into our next chapter, where we'll begin to unravel some films in which queer identity is not so much represented by body horror, but tormented by it. In the 1980s, when body horror as a genre was truly finding its footing, the queer community was ravaged by the AIDS epidemic. AIDS was inescapable for queer people in the 80s and is still a pressing concern for queer people today. A sexually transmitted illness that has no cure and often leads to death, AIDS ran rampant in queer communities due to its easy transmutability and economic factors that put marginalized populations at extreme risk. Not to mention a complete lack of government action to curb the effects of AIDS, especially under the Reagan administration. Of course, AIDS is not exclusive to queer people, but the disease proved especially dangerous for those in the LGBTQ community, especially gay men. The idea of a potential partner or a set of partners appearing healthy while masking a life-threatening illness that's not easily detectable was a present fear for queer persons at this time, and should legitimately remain a fear for all people to this day. But it's the initial AIDS epidemic of the 1980s that really worked its way into body horror. In John Carpenter's 1982 cult classic The Thing, viewers follow an isolated research team, all male, who slowly fall victim to a predatory alien that can exactly duplicate any life form after entering its victim's bloodstream. The film alternates between nail-biting moments of tension created by not knowing who the creature has transformed into, and visceral scenes of body horror as the alien invader morphs its host into twisted shadows of their former selves. The parallels to the AIDS crisis are obvious and made all the more unavoidable by the fact that the film was released a mere year after the crisis first began. The central male characters of the film are archetypes of masculinity. Much has been made about their realism, and I think that's apt praise, but it doesn't detract from the fact that the men routinely reveal a hyper-masculine identity underlying their every action. The horror of the film comes in how these portraits of masculine strength are subverted and torn apart, quite literally by a threat that is secretive and always 2 steps ahead. It's easy to read the plot of the film as an exploration of how a hyper-masculine society too proud to admit infection for fear of being cast out might fall at the hands of a disease like AIDS. Greg Mucci, in a 2017 article on the queer subtext of The Thing, writes of AIDS, quote, "To be infected meant a clash against heteronormativity, just as declaring yourself uninfected meant an embrace of heteronormative ways. To be infected was to be different, and in uncertain times, different is deadly." The Thing explores the AIDS epidemic from the perspective of the heteronormative male, mining the real response to the disease for horror in a multitude of ways. And this would be far from the last time that STDs, specifically AIDS, would find their way into body horror. Released only 4 years after The Thing, David Cronenberg's The Fly tells the story of Seth Brundle, a scientist working on a teleportation device who accidentally melds his DNA with that of a housefly. The premise doesn't quite evoke evoke images of a life-threatening disease, but Seth's ensuing transformation is slow, horrific, and deeply rooted in fears about AIDS. Unlike The Thing, Cronenberg's The Fly dwells on the decay of the human body. The disease becomes not some quick and undetectable fear, but an obvious and ongoing process of deterioration. Due to this difference in subject matter, The Fly is able to explore something The Thing could not: how we as people come to grapple with knowing someone has a disease, specifically how to cope as the partner of someone with a serious STD like AIDS. Gina Davis plays Seth's partner Veronica, who becomes pregnant with Seth's child and, in one of the film's most unsettling scenes, dreams that she will give birth to a bizarre larva of sorts. It's exaggerated, yes, but the scene plays on a serious fear for people capable of pregnancy during the AIDS crisis, that their children would be born with the illness. In the modern era, the AIDS epidemic still crops up from time to time. The 2014 film It Follows, while notably less centered around body horror than The Thing and The Fly, explores the concept of a sexually transmitted ghost. In the film, having sex with someone might mean constant, slow pursuit by a shape-shifting entity that will never stop chasing you. The only way to get rid of the illness is by passing it on to someone else, but even then, once the ghost gets that person, it will just start coming for you again. The movie rests on the fear of a constantly approaching death that is brought on by intercourse, obviously a parallel to STDs. The link is less central than in other films I've discussed here, specifically because It Follows might truly be more about the specter of aging than anything, but the ghost pursuing our main characters takes on the form of real people, playing on the already mentioned idea of STDs as an invisible disease, and the film brings direct attention to the types of class differences that lead to the increased spread of STDs among marginalized communities. So horror, for as much as it can be a vessel of empowering queer celebration, has never been shy about addressing what is probably the most devastating modern crisis facing the queer community. And I'm sure there are some people watching this who might take issue with the portrayal of illness in these films and say that they exploit those with serious diseases like AIDS for shock value and scares. While I believe that the main villains of all these movies are disease itself and not the people with the diseases, that observation does speak to a very real history of painting queer characters in horror as villainous in nature. I won't discount your opinion if you feel movies like The Thing, The Fly, or It Follows are harmful in nature, but I believe if you really want to talk about the vilification of queerness in horror, you have to have a much different conversation and tackle the archetype of the queer horror villain. In the early 1920s, around the same time that some of the oldest horror movies like Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari were being released, Hollywood was rocked by a vast number of scandals. From murders to abuse to sexual assaults, the Hollywood of the 1920s was marred by controversies that led the film industry to be seen as a den of sickness and perversion by the mass public. Moral panic transformed into political pressure, and soon enough, there were massive efforts to censor Hollywood and film as a whole. Born from these efforts was the Hays Code, a set of rigid censorship guidelines widely adopted in an effort to push film away from the taboo. Most importantly for us, the Hays Code included homosexuality under the banner of sexual perversion, and all but barred anything queer from appearing in film. The only way for characters who were queer or queer-coded to appear on screen was if they were villainous and eventually punished for their perceived transgressions against heteronormativity. Now, make no mistake, Hollywood was not some shining example of queer representation before the Hays Code, but the code cemented this idea that queer characters could not appear on screen as anything other than strictly villains. And while the Hays Code was abandoned with time, the concept of the queer antagonist still persists to this day. We see it reflected in Disney villains and effeminate evil masterminds, but if there's anywhere the idea of the queer villain really took root, it's been in horror. There is an endless list of queer-coded or outright queer horror villains, and most of those villains admittedly promote negative ideas about queer people in general. But if we want to honestly discuss the role and legacy of the queer horror villain, we have to discuss the bizarre way that these villains can often become strangely empowering. To truly understand the complex role of the queer antagonist in horror, I think it's essential to first understand the particular way in which horror audiences tend to sympathize with the villain. Whether it emerges from the often sympathetic backstories of these villains, the exaggerated and campy designs, the macabre desire to see evil prosper, the annoying nature of many horror protagonists, or the simple fact that horror villains are, especially in the slasher genre, often the main draw, it's common knowledge that audiences love to root for a good horror antagonist. And since horror is a genre specially designed to celebrate and elevate its villains, we often see the same type of queer antagonists that pop up in other genres, whether intentionally or by accident, given a space to shine and be sympathized with in horror. It's the concept that Susan Stryker evoked in her quote from the start of the video, the idea that there's empowerment to be found when queer people lean into villainous portrayals, specifically portrayals of villains that transgress bodily norms. The elephant in the room here is the aforementioned Buffalo Bill from Jonathan Demme's The Silence of the Lambs. And while that character possesses elements of a great body horror queer antagonist, he fails to really become a sympathetic queer villain for a few reasons. First off, the main villain in Silence is divided into two characters, Bill and Hannibal Lecter, the true sympathetic villain of the piece. Bill is just unlikable, and even as much as I love the Goodbye Horses scene, Hannibal is the real star of the show here. Charismatic, well-spoken, and mysterious, Hannibal is everything Bill wishes he could be. Additionally, Bill fails to be a sympathetic queer villain because of the specific type of film he's placed in. Silence of the Lambs is as much a crime thriller as it is a horror movie, and I think crime thrillers get just a bit too real for fans to find the villains in them any type of sympathetic. It's the difference between loving Jason from Friday the 13th and admiring Jeffrey Dahmer. One is exaggerated, highly fictional, and extremely entertaining, while the other is way too steeped in reality and real, horrible events that occur all the time. Bill, as a fictional serial killer in a film that's half horror, half detective procedural, ultimately fails to come out as sympathetic in any way whatsoever because he hits just a bit too close to our actual world. We might be able to draw brief glimpses of meaningful experience from his character or specific scenes he features in, but overall it's just a bit too real. Hannibal, on the other hand, is a full horror villain, theatrical and not all that believable. While we can't really discuss him here because he's not all that queer, I think there's definitely something to be said for how effeminate Lecter is played and how hard fans shipped him and Detective Will Graham in the show Hannibal. Although if you're at home screaming at me right now for missing how obviously queer Hannibal is, I definitely encourage you to make your own video about it and make me look very silly. But having gotten Bill out of the way, if we want to really start our conversation about queer horror villains who elicit actual audience sympathy, we gotta go all the way back to 1974 and talk about Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film follows a group of teens who wander a bit too far into rural Texas and encounter the cannibalistic Sawyer family. From that description, you can probably gather what follows: chainsaw chases in the wilderness, furniture made of bones, etc. The Sawyers are a whole interesting cast of characters in themselves, but one member of the family, Leatherface, has very much surpassed the other antagonist of the film. He's become an icon of horror and a premier slasher villain, one that audiences turn up in droves to root for, making it all the more interesting that the character is kind of queer-coded. About halfway through the original Texas Chainsaw, Leatherface adorns this bizarre and macabre form of drag, not too dissimilar from what we saw in Silence of the Lambs with Buffalo Bill. The main difference here is that Silence and Chainsaw are radically different films, the former a realistic thriller and the latter a wild, sweaty, and disgusting prototype of slasher cinema, one that, while it can be a bit real at points, never comes off as all that believable. And if the original Chainsaw didn't set up a perfect opportunity for fans to sympathize with a queer-coded villain, the countless sequels and spin-offs of the film most certainly have. While latter installments in the Texas Chainsaw franchise have distanced from the cross-dressing aspect of Leatherface's character, the original incarnation still stands as the definitive one, and in a world where so many people love Leatherface, I find it interesting and honestly kind of cool that the queer coding hasn't been forgotten. If anything, it's been reclaimed by fans who now see Leatherface as so detached from that original film that they can do with the character whatever they want. Additionally, in Chainsaw, the Sawyers are meant to represent the American underbelly, and while Leatherface cross-dressing is definitely played for shock value, I think it also serves as a hint towards the buried reality of queer life in the United States during the 1970s, a reality that appeared just as horrific as Leatherface to those who tried to ignore or minimize it. In a world where queer people have so often been relegated to villains on screen, we have to find relatability in weird pockets, and queer-coded villains who play on body horror, such as Leatherface, offer just that, an opportunity to see ourselves and our struggles made real in some type of way. But in many instances, we don't even need to transform a work to find ourselves in it. Chainsaw, and by proxy other horror classics with queer-coded villains like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, definitely possess some queer subtext that audiences can find empowerment through. But I find myself wondering how valuable that even is in a world where we have a gender-fluid murderous doll, a drag queen mad scientist, a transgender vampire, a lesbian vampire, a gay vampire, a bisexual vampire. Okay, lots of vampire stuff. But so often the queer-coded horror villain is made just outright queer, and in these instances, we find the subtext of body horror as a means of exploring queer identity to be extremely overt. Rocky Horror Picture Show tells the story of a straight couple wandering into a world of the queer, the theatrical, and the gothic. They leave completely transformed just as much by the horror of it all as by the queerness, drawing a clear parallel between the two. The main villain of the film, if you'd even call them that, Dr. Frankenfurter, self-describes as a sweet transvestite, lending this obvious and undeniable queerness to the film. Seed of Chucky, the 5th installment in the Child's Play series, explores the obsession with slotting kids into masculine or feminine roles by connecting that experience with being trapped in the body of a genderless doll. It doesn't get much more body horror as queer experience than that. In the film, Glenn/Glenda, the child of Chucky and his bride Tiffany, is constantly flipping between wanting to be a man and a woman, again making the queer subtext we so often find in horror into actual, irrefutable text. And without getting too far into the next section of this video, there are a ton of other horror movies and media wherein the villains possess outwardly queer identities. Yes, so often we are left to search desperately for any morsel of queer representation we can find in horror villains, but that's dramatically changing as we moved into a new era of queer politics and begun seeing queer-coded villains getting turned into antagonists who are just straight up queer. And these examples of actual queer representation embodied through horror villains hint at the logical progression of this entire video and of queer body horror as a whole, the modern queer horror renaissance we are currently living through. As I already touched on, I grew up with horror, the type of queer or queer-coded horror that this video is all about. While I didn't understand it all at first, coming out as queer has allowed me to go back to horror films from my youth and examine them with a new, empowered lens. Aforementioned films such as Sleepaway Camp, The Thing, The Fly, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Ginger Snaps, and so on now feel so painfully obvious to me in their queer subtext that I have to kick myself for not seeing it all sooner. But understanding these movies in a new light left me wondering, why has no one used the queer foundation so obviously inherent to body horror to make an amazing scary movie about gender, sexuality, or both? What I've come to realize is that a hell of a lot of people already have. Titane, the 2021 film by director Julia Ducournau, tells the story of a serial killer who, after going on the run from the police, disguises herself as the missing son of a firefighter. What follows is an emotional and heartbreaking story of seeking one's true identity and finding unconditional love in found family. All that might not paint the most horrific picture of the film, but I did leave out the part where our main character has sex with a car and becomes pregnant with the child of that automobile. It's kind of like if the hospital scene from The Fly was a whole movie, so terrifying, horrific, and textbook body horror. So Titane is a body horror film, basically the strictest definition of one, and it's also a film that grapples with understanding queer identity, the process of coming out, and specifically the experience of trans men, especially pregnant ones. In many ways, it is the conclusion of everything this video has been building towards, a film that melds body horror and queer experience into one and does it all in a tasteful, overt, and impactful way. And luckily for us, it's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to recent queer body horror. Oftentimes now, queer or queer-coded characters are not the villains or antagonizing forces at all. In many cases, they are our leads, and horror is being used as a means to explore the otherization and challenges that those leads face. Gone are plots like those found in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, where Freddy Krueger kind of represents being gay and violently forces his way into the body of our male lead, the conclusion of the film becoming all about overcoming queerness to conform to heterosexuality in a way. Now, there are films like the Fear Street Saga, where the survival of queer romance is our happy ending, and murderous slasher villains and possessive forces represent the leftover trauma of queer oppression. Speaking of Fear Street, there's the very similar Stranger Things, where queer characters have to fight against horrific forces that threaten to consume their world and assimilate them into a lifeless version of reality. Now, possession and domination by horror villains represents the threat of queer erasure instead of just the threat of becoming queer. For a shining example of how queer body horror has transformed in recent decades, compare the 1994 version of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire to the modern-day adaptation running on AMC right now. The 90s film left the queer entirely as subtext, and there's definitely something to be said about how one might interpret the story about queer-coded vampires to be equating the misery of vampiric existence with the perceived misery of queer life, something yours truly might be diving into in a video coming very soon. But the AMC show dispels that interpretation entirely, telling a story that embraces queerness fully, makes it all overt, and frames clearly the pain of Interview's central queer romance as one rooted in relationship toxicity, not simply being queer. Becoming a vampire is still a semi-metaphor for embracing queer life, but it's centrally a metaphor for how dangerous and secretive that life must be and how others can use queer oppression to manipulate their partners. Even films that come and go, such as the already forgotten They/Them, which I will probably never see, frame queer characters in heroic roles fighting against the horror of queer oppression and forced bodily transformation. But even when we have queer villains on screen now, they're often handled in a tasteful and empowering way. To again go back to AMC's Interview with a Vampire, the queerness of Lestat, the show's central antagonist, is never the thing that makes us dislike or fear him. In fact, it's become the main thing endearing viewers to his character, as we can read him to be a flawed individual suffering with the reality of his vampirism and his queer oppression, two things that give him a life and body that differs from the norm. The Child's Play franchise has now evolved into a television show called Chucky, where protagonists get to be queer, yes, but so do the villains. The show frequently plays with gender and sexuality, never framing queerness as evil, but still allowing evil characters to be queer. So yeah, even queer horror villains are experiencing a renaissance in the modern day. Horror, a genre that has always had the potential to be this empowering force for queer liberation, has finally fully stepped into that role, and now is leading the charge in terms of queer narratives on screen. There is definitely a long way to go, but films like 2019's Bit are making transgender characters horror protagonists instead of subtextual villains. Movies like Jennifer's Body, a very lesbian and feminist horror masterpiece from only a decade ago, are getting reevaluated, and every day something new is getting announced in the world of horror that proudly features queer characters. To watch horror grow and develop in all these new ways is truly awesome. It brings me so much joy that the genre of film I've always felt so seen by is literally telling stories about people like me, where I don't need to squint my eyes or examine from a certain angle to feel deeply empowered or spoken to. And the really great thing is that everyone else seems to be enjoying these movies just as much as I do. Horror, a genre so often used for entertainment, is becoming a perfect vehicle to translate queer experiences and struggles to diverse groups of people. As I look back on the past few years of queer representation in not just body horror, but horror as a whole, I'm incredibly proud. But I get so excited for what the future might hold. As this video outlines, there's such a rich foundation of queer experience as specifically body horror to draw from, and I know there are filmmakers out there who will transform that foundation into new movies where complex queer ideas and experiences are given room to be explored properly. I truly hope this is a video I can add to in a few years, bringing to the conversation films that haven't been released yet but will transform the discourse around queer body horror as a whole. Of course, course, I will always hold a special place in my heart for the body horror movies where I first caught glimpses of myself. Those films were and are special to me in a way that I can never truly explain, no matter how long of a YouTube video about them I make. But my relationship to those films will forever be complicated. For all the representation and empowerment I read into those movies, there's a sea of evidence there to tell me that my interpretations were either false or misguided. So as we move deeper into this next chapter of body horror, where queerness is brought to the forefront, I don't think we should necessarily forget everything that has come before. Characters like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Angela Baker, they all meant something. And for many people, myself included, they still do. But let's remember that there's more out there than just them. Be comfortable calling out the issues with these films and looking for media that handles queerness better, because it is out there, and every day more of it gets made. I started this video talking about how I was introduced to trans identity through The Silence of the Lambs. In a lot of ways, I'm happy I had something there to show me an alternative to being cis, to let me know that the identity I was assigned at birth does not limit my expression overall. But I wish it would have been any other movie that showed me that. It sucks that the first time I saw myself on screen, it was as a monster. I've spent so much of this video talking about how empowering it can be to see yourself in the monster, but the truth is, it will never be the same as just seeing yourself as human. I didn't really grow up getting to see myself honestly represented in horror. It's a sad fact about the genre I love so much that I can never really escape. But it's my hope that as horror grows, expands, matures, and diversifies, queer body horror will be there for a new generation of kids, even more so than it ever was for me. And that, guys, is the video. I hope you enjoyed this one. It took me forever to get together and to put out. It's probably my most ambitious video to date, even though I do have some scripts in the work that kind of eclipse it in scope and scale and all that good stuff. But yeah, I'm incredibly happy with where the channel is growing. I've been getting more views, more subscribers recently, and I feel like I'm really on the verge of taking off and doing even greater and bigger and better things with this channel in the future. If you are at all interested in supporting me or this channel, making it easier for me to produce videos in the future, I would highly recommend heading over to Patreon. Shout out to the one patron I have over there. I love you. Thank you. So that was kind of a lie. When this video was filmed, I had only one patron, but now it's risen to 3. And 2 are in the shout out tier, so special thanks to Grace and Kaya for supporting the channel. And I'm still gonna give a shout out to Elliot for being my first ever patron. Also, while I was editing this video, I hit 1,000 subscribers, making it possible for me to get ads on my content and actually make some money from YouTube. I've mentioned before that I don't have the most reliable financial situation, so needless to say, this has been awesome, and I just want to thank all of you who helped me reach this milestone. It's been a dream of mine for a long time to have an audience on YouTube, and it's surreal for that dream to be realized like this. So again, thank you. But yeah, Patreon's the greatest place to support me, honestly, or to share the video, give it a like, give it a comment, boost in the algorithm. That would be amazing. But yeah, again, I hope you guys loved the video. I put a lot of my soul into it. So I hope you guys really found something valuable in it, and I hope that it gets you thinking about queer body horror in general and the future of where this very interesting subgenre is going. But as always, I have been Ellie, you have been wonderful, and until next time, bye!